This intercooled RIPP Supercharger kit is for those of you that have a 2015 to 2018 JK that are looking to add a ton of additional power to your Jeep. This is going to be a kit that is a bolt-on installation anybody can do in their driveway or in their garage in about a day or so, and we'll talk a little bit more about that installation in just a second. So if you have a JK, you have some maybe bigger tires on the Jeep, it's feeling like it's a little bit sluggish, a little bit slower, adding some power is probably on your mind. I always recommend going to re-gearing first if you're feeling sluggish because of the big tire. There's nothing like giving your Jeep back that mechanical advantage of having the proper gear ratio. But if you've already done that and you're still looking for a little bit more of a push, forced injection is a great way to go. And if you're looking at that, again, I like the RIPP kits for the ease of installation and also for how reliable they are once you get everything installed. Now, a supercharger is not going to be an inexpensive way to add power to your Jeep, but it is going to be an incredibly effective one if you have the budget. As far as the way this kit is assembled, it comes with all the pieces that you need, and the main piece is this centrifugal supercharger. So this is going to be a belt-driven supercharger. Might look a little bit like a turbo to some of you guys right off the bat, but it is belt-driven, so it is going to be a supercharger. And this uses the Vortec V3 supercharger. It is a tried and true supercharger. It is going to work and work really well for you. All of the rest of the bits that were put together are designed to make this bolt directly into your JK. So again, this kit does come with the intercooler. You can get the kit without the intercooler if you want to save a little bit of money, if you don't feel like you need it. But this air-to-air intercooler is going to cool down that charged air, so you're going to be able to get that much more power out of the Jeep. The rest of the components are all sort of supporting cast for what you see over here. So you're going to have some larger injectors. Anytime you put more air into the engine, you're also going to have to put more fuel into it. You have your tensioner over here because of course you're going to have a different belt routing for your new supercharger. You're going to have your air filter. Everything else that goes along with this to make it a completely bolt-on install. Right here, you have a transcooler as well. This kit is specifically for those of you with the automatic transmission, so it does come with that transcooler. Putting a little bit more power through the transmission can heat things up, and heat is definitely the enemy of an auto trans, so you have that additional cooler right here. Now, the reason that this kit is for a 15 to 18 JK is because of the way the ECUs are on those Jeeps. There wasn't a good way to completely crack the ECU using a tuner, so what you have to do is during this installation, you have to pull out your ECU, you have to send it to RIPP with some additional information, and then they'll send you back a cracked ECU that will then let you use the Diablo Sport tuner that's included in this kit to get everything up and running for you. So as I mentioned, with the 15 to 18 JKs, you do have to send out your ECU to RIPP to have them crack that before you can tune the Jeep. That's what we did, and then put it on the rollers. Stock, the Jeep made 190 horsepower and 197 foot-pounds of torque, and after installing the supercharger, it made 309 horsepower and 281 foot-pounds of torque. That is a total peak gain of 119 horsepower and 84 foot-pounds of torque, and curve gains at around 6,000 RPM of 121 horsepower and 107 foot-pounds of torque. Forced induction is certainly not an inexpensive way to get more power out of your Jeep, but it is a very effective one, and if you have the $6,900 budget, I would definitely recommend this kit. There are some other superchargers out there, some Root style, and some other brands out there that will still give you some gains, but for reliability and for ease of install, I really like the RIPP kit, so I would definitely recommend going with this option if you have the money. This is going to be a kit that is a bolt-on installation anybody can do in their driveway or in their garage in about a day or so. We're gonna have one of our members of the install team show you exactly how to do it.
First step, we're gonna remove the factory airbox. Using a flathead screwdriver, we're gonna loosen the band clamp up. We'll use a 10mm to remove these two front bolts. We'll unhook the airbox. You have to disconnect this tube back here. swing this whole assembly up. And then we'll disconnect this line down here. To remove the lower section of the airbox, just pull up on it. Next step, we're going to remove the upper shroud. Just want to pry the push pins out, and then we'll remove it and set it aside. Next step, we're going to remove the coolant overflow tank. There's one push pin in the top. We're going to go ahead and remove that. You can do this using a flathead screwdriver. Pull that out, disconnect this line. By pulling up on it, you can slide it up and out of the vehicle. We're going to set this aside. This will not be reused later on. Next step, we're going to disconnect the vacuum lines, map sensor, and the throttle body. Start by pulling the vacuum lines off. You may need to use a flathead screwdriver to loosen the rubber. Disconnect the map sensor. I want to release the red locking tab. And then we'll disconnect the throttle body. And then we'll free up these wires here. Next step, we're going to disconnect the large data plug on the passenger side. Pull back on the red locking tab, squeeze the tab on the side and pull the sleeve towards you, and we'll separate the plug. After you've disconnected the harness, we're going to pry up on this clip here to separate it from the intake manifold. We'll tuck that up and out of the way. Next step is to remove the intake manifold. We'll begin using an 8mm to remove the top 7 screws. Disconnect these tubes from the intake and move them out of your way. To access this last bolt, we're going to pry this foam piece off. We'll remove that from the vehicle. These are captured bolts, so we're going to leave them in there for now. And we'll pull that whole intake off. So now we're going to switch to a 10mm. And we're going to remove these two on the side of the intake. And we're going to save those for reuse later. Using a 10, we're going to remove these other 2 nuts and then we'll pull this whole plate out so we can get the intake out. And once you have all 4 nuts off, go ahead and pry these lines up and off. And that should give us enough to get the intake out. Next step, we're gonna remove these 2 on the driver's side and these 2 up here. And disconnect this line, and then we'll take this whole intake out. After that's done, you want to just check for any hoses or wires that are still connected, and then we'll go ahead and try to pull this intake off. Once we have everything disconnected, all the lines and wires, we're going to go ahead and pull this off. And just lift it up, slide it to the side. After you've removed the intake manifold, cover it with a rag or piece of tape, making sure you get no debris inside the intake. Now that we've removed the intake manifold, we're going to go ahead and pull the factory injectors. We're going to begin by removing this foam piece, setting that aside. We'll begin by prying up on the red locking tab. Once we release that, we can disconnect the injectors. I'm going to press in the tab on the side and unplug the injector. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to disconnect the rest of this plate to remove it to access the injectors. There are 2 10mm nuts down on the side, and we're going to try to get out. Once we remove the last 2 nuts, we're going to go ahead and remove this harness from the plate, and then we're going to pull the plate out. After we have all the injectors unplugged, we're going to disconnect the fuel line here at the rail, and we're going to relieve some of this pressure. You're going to want to place a rag there because it will spill a little bit of fuel. So once we get the blue lock off, and we can remove the other lock and pull this fuel rail off. Next, we're going to use a T27 Torx bit to remove the fuel rail bolts. Now we can go ahead and try to remove the fuel rail. So now that we have the fuel rail out, we're going to go ahead and switch to the new injectors. So we want to pull the OEM injectors out. Place a small amount of grease on the O-ring for ease of installation. And we'll go ahead and install that in the fuel rail. Same thing, pull the next one out. Uncap a new injector. Install some grease around it. And we'll reinsert it. So now that we have the new injectors installed in the fuel rail, we're ready to reinstall it in the vehicle. RIPP supplies you with new screws and spacers since the new injectors are taller than the factory ones. Now that we have that in place, we want to get our spacers installed. Drop those where they need to go. Go ahead and drop our new screws through and get them started. Whatever you do, do not drop it down the intake. All right, so now that we have the new screws, the spacers, and the injectors installed, we're going to go ahead and make sure that those are seated. And then we'll go ahead and tighten these screws up. All right, now once you're done that, you want to cover your intake back up. So we don't want any debris to fall in there. And we're going to reconnect all the injectors. Make sure to lock those red locking tabs. Push this harness back in. Do the same thing for the other side. Make sure they seat all the way down and lock. The next step is going to be to remove the coil packs, pull the spark plugs out. We're going to re-gap them. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to go ahead and take the bolts out, holding the coils down. We're just going to pull these coils out, move them, set them aside. After we remove the coils, we're going to pull the plugs out. We're going to use a 5/8. And then most likely you'll need a magnet to fish them out. So once you have the plug out, we're going to check the gap. They want the gap to be 32 thousandths. We're going to bend the electrode a little bit. Just keep measuring until we get a good fit. Once you have a gap to 32 thousandths, we're going to place it back in there. We'll fish another one out, and we'll do the same. Now that we have them properly gapped, we're going to go ahead, tighten them back up, and reinsert the coil packs. So now that we have the plugs tightened up, we're going to go ahead and reinsert the coils, and then we'll continue with the other side. Now that the plugs are gapped and back in, we're going to go ahead and reinsert the coils. Use your 10mm and tighten up the coil packs. So the next step, since we installed taller injectors, we're going to need to trim the intake manifold. So I'll show you how to do that right now. So first we're going to need to trim these two edges off, and then we'll have to grind that at a slant. So now that we've cut this section out, we're going to go ahead and grind that on an angle. Now that we've done the final trimming on the intake, we're going to go ahead and put that back on the vehicle. We're going to put this hose back on that we took off. We're going to begin by reinserting the piece of foam on the driver's side. Once we have that on, we'll go ahead and reinsert the intake manifold. To fit it into the brackets on the driver's side, we're going to need to shift it to the passenger side slightly. Once we have it on there, we'll go ahead and go around and start all the bolts. You want to make sure nothing is caught in the intake manifold when bolting it back on. And that everything is free. Then we'll go around and we'll just do the final torque. Now once we have that all bolted down, we're going to go ahead and reconnect all the vacuum lines, the map sensor, and the throttle body. One more hose over here on the side. And then there's going to be 2 nuts here and 2 nuts back there. And we'll require a 10mm socket. So now we're ready to reinstall this plate. So now that we have this plate reinstalled, we're going to go ahead and connect the main harness here. Watch that, push the locking tab in. So now we're going to remove the factory map sensor and we're going to install the new one that RIPP provides. If you can get a good spot, go ahead and pry that up. Next step, we're going to remove the electric cooling fan. There's 2 8mm bolts, and we're going to unplug that and pull it out. Next step, we're going to remove the serpentine belt from the power steering pump pulley using a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar. Using a 1/2-inch breaker bar, loosen tension on the belt and pull it off the power steering pump. Next step, we're going to remove the tensioner. Using a 13mm, remove the upper and lower bolt. Removing the tensioner exposes this cover plate. Use a 16mm socket to remove that cover plate. Next step, we're going to remove the power steering pump. There's two 13mm bolts up top and one down the bottom. After we do that, we're just going to let it hang to the side. So now we're ready to install the relocation brackets from RIPP. The top bracket has supplied 5/16 Allen head screws, and then we're going to reuse the factory hardware for the upper. After you have the Allen key bolts installed, we're going to torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Next step, we're going to install the lower relocation mount. We're going to use the factory bolt to bolt it to the block. So now that we have the relocation mounts installed, we're going to go and install the power steering pump. So we're going to slip the lower end onto the stud. We'll reuse the factory hardware for the two top ones. Next, we're going to drain the coolant out of the radiator. First, we'll remove the radiator cap, and then we'll unscrew the petcock underneath to drain the fluid. Next step, we're going to remove the lower rad hose. I'm going to slide that factory clamp back off. Pull off the rad hose after the radiator has drained. And then we're going to trim 3 to 4 inches off of it. So now we're going to measure about 3 inches back. Now that we've got that cut, go ahead and reinstall that. Reinstall the clamp. And then you want to point the clamp at the 11 o'clock position so that it doesn't contact the supercharger. or any piping. Next step, we're gonna remove this clamp and pull this hose off. Now that we have this hose off, we're gonna measure 1.5 inches back, and then we're going to cut that off. On the next step, we're going to take a 3/8 drive extension. We're going to insert it in this tube. And RIPP wants you to bend it up till we have about 1/4 inch in between the alternator and the tube. Just like that. Now we're going to bend this tube up. And reinstall that. Next step, we're going to install the supplied tensioner with a supplied 10mm bolt. And the neutral orientation of the tensioner is going to be about 1 o'clock. Next step, we're going to remove the power steering reservoir. And we're going to let that hang to the side. That will give us access to the 10mm holding the radiator to the radiator support. So we're going to take both of these out of both sides. Now we're going to pull the bushings out. And that way we can move the radiator forward to make room for the supercharger. So now we're going to place the bushings on the back side. And we're going to reinstall those. Once you've done that, you can reinstall the power steering reservoir. Next, we're going to remove the upper 3 bolts. This will get us ready to install the supercharger bracket. You're going to need a 13 for the 2 lowers and a 15 for the upper. So the next step, we're going to bend this lower heater hose up until it's about the same height as this. That's going to leave you room to install that supercharger in there. Once we get the supercharger in, you may need to tweak this slightly more. So we're going to bend it up and then bend this lower section in. That should be good like that for now. So the next step in this installation, we're gonna prep the blower to install on the vehicle. RIPP tells you to uninstall the shipping plug. And then we're gonna reinstall a new vent plug with a copper washer. And you're gonna need a 3/16 Allen key for this. So at this point in time, we're ready to install the supercharger. So we're gonna need to bend that line some more. Let's see if that gives us enough room. So while you're supporting the supercharger, we're gonna go ahead and fish it around the pulley. Try to get this somewhat set up. Once you've got that, you can insert this bolt here. All right, so now that we have the supercharger in, we're gonna go around and tighten all these bolts up, and then we'll work on getting the belt tensioned around the new tensioner. So now that we have the supercharger all tightened down, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the belt. So you'll wanna use a 3/8 drive ratchet or breaker bar to get to the tensioner, the supply tensioner that RIPP offered us. And then we're gonna go ahead and get the belt back on. Make sure that the belt is on all the pulleys and lined up. And then once you've got that, you're good. Next step, we're gonna remove the grille so we can pull out the factory transmission cooler. There's 6 clips located in the top of the grille. You can pry up on the center to remove them. Once you've done that, set your clips aside so you don't lose them. We'll pull the grille forward. And then you're just gonna pull on the bottom to disconnect it. And once you've done that, we're gonna pull the grille forward a little bit, and then we'll disconnect these lights. You need to pull back on the red locking tab. And then squeeze the black plastic tab. And then you can unclip the light. We'll begin by disconnecting the transmission lines at the cooler. You're going to use a 10mm to remove the bolt. And place a rag underneath as a little oil may spill out. Next, we'll use our 10mm to remove the 3 bolts holding the cooler in. Passenger side is going to be an 8mm bolt. Once we have all of those removed, we can pull the transmission cooler out. Be careful not to tip it, as oil may spill. So to disconnect these lines, you're going to need to pull this cap off of the top. Once you have this cap up, there's going to be a spring clip here, and if you can find the orientation, we can go ahead and use a pick tool to pry that off. Now once we get that off, we'll be able to disconnect the line. So you want to do that for the other side as well. You're going to want to place a bucket underneath or a towel to catch any fluid that falls. All right, so now that these are disconnected, we're going to go ahead and pull them out. These will not be reused, as RIPP provides new rubber lines to install. So we're now ready to install the supplied transmission cooler from RIPP. So we're going to go ahead and get started on that. Okay, so we're going to begin by peeling the backing off of these blocks. Then we're going to attach them to the back of the transmission cooler. That way they'll stick on there. We'll insert that through there. Install the supplied foam block. We'll go ahead and do that with the other side. And find a spot to push this through. You don't want to force it. Install the block on the back side. And now that we have all those in place, we're going to go ahead and drop this in and push it the rest of the way through the condenser and the radiator. And we're going to measure our 4 inches above the cross member. And then once we have that set, we can go ahead and start poking these through. And once you have those fully inserted, we're going to go ahead and insert these locking tabs. And we'll go ahead and pull those tight, and then we'll trim them later on. So now that we have the coolers secured and mounted, we're gonna go ahead and hook the lines up. So we're gonna run this line down through here, install one of the supplied clamps, once we have that line on, you can go ahead and tighten this clamp up. You're gonna need a 1/4 inch socket. Now that we have that tight, we're gonna go down, cut the end of this line off and install it on the trans line. So now we'll fish our line up here, get an idea of how long we need to cut it. Cut it right about there. We'll install a hose clamp. Once you have the rubber line on, we can go ahead and tighten the clamp up. Now that we have that tight, we'll go ahead and get the other one installed. Now we're going to run this other line back up so we can attach it to the transmission cooler. Same thing, get an idea how much line you need, and then we're going to cut the excess off and we'll go ahead and install that on the transmission cooler. When you install the clamps, you're going to be able to tighten it once you have it on. So we'll slide this on. In this step, we'll be modifying the fan to fit around this supercharger air inlet. First step, we're going to undo this wiring and we're going to zip tie it out of the way so we can make our cuts and keep it safe. So we're going to need to cut this about half as tall as it is. And then we'll need to grind this section down as well. So we'll make our marks. And we'll need to grind some of this off. And this will have to get cut completely off. So now that we've trimmed the fan shroud, we're going to go ahead and cut this zip tie off. We're going to reroute this harness so down under here. We want to get that tucked in there. Flatten that out. So we want this wire to stay in this little notch that we carved out. So we're gonna apply a zip tie here, and that should hold it down. All right, so installing the fan, we want to get that one side under, pass it down. Now the two bottom have tabs that are going to slide into their little holders. You want to make sure that those are seated so your fan doesn't move around. Now that that's back in, we can go ahead and reinsert the 8mm screws, one for each side at the top, and then we'll tighten those up. And we'll plug this back into that. And then plug the fan back in. To make room for the intercooler piping that's going to pass through here, we're going to remove these clips and trim these pieces off. So using a screwdriver or a trim panel removal tool, we're going to remove these clips here, and then we're just going to cut and trim off this excess. We're going to do the same thing with the other side. Pull the two pins out. Next step in the install process, since we have to feed this tube through here, we're going to have to trim some of that away so that it fits. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the intercooler, and RIPP wants you to center it. So we're going to get it centered, and then we're going to mark about where we have to cut. And then we'll go ahead and trim that, and then we'll test fit it again. Should give us plenty of room to fit that pipe through. Okay, it looks like we should be good, so we can start piecing it together. We're gonna do the same thing for the other side. We're gonna need a trim so we can fit the intercooler piping through. If you want to clean up those edges, you can use a file. So now that we have both sides trimmed, we're going to go ahead and start assembling the intercooler and the piping. So we're going to pull both these ends off. We're going to take the two sleeves that are provided. We'll insert those. Make sure to put your band clamp on. We'll just snug those up for now. then we're gonna fit the other sections of pipe. All right, so make sure to install your clamp. We're gonna slide this piece of pipe through. Now we're going to go inside, remove this piece of plastic. We're going to take this section, we're going to try to fit that on there. Now once it's sufficiently on far enough, we'll go ahead and we'll tighten this clamp up. We're going to do all the finishing tightening later on. All right, so now we're ready to assemble the other side. Go ahead and place your clamp on. It's pretty loose, so you can get it a little tight. We're gonna feed this pipe through. Now, you may have to bend your AC line to get this pipe to fit through. So this AC line right here, this lower one, that contacts the pipe. So we're gonna need to bend it to the side a little bit. Try to get it out of our way. All right, so once you have this pipe in, we're gonna go ahead, just tighten this clamp up just a little bit because we're still gonna have to mess with everything. So now that we have this driver's side pipe in, we're gonna go ahead and install the next angled rubber hose. You may need to bend this power steering line out of the way and this AC line here so that you can fit this piece in. And it's a very tight fit. Slide our next pipe clamp on. And then we're ready for the next section. Next, we're going to install the blow-off valve into this pipe. Slide that on, place the clamp on, tighten it up with a flathead screwdriver. Make sure both those clamps are nice and tight. And we're going to install this piece over here, facing down like that. And once we've got that in, we'll go ahead Tighten this clamp up a little bit. All right, so the last piece of the puzzle. Next step, we're gonna install this elbow. All right, now that we've got that on, tighten that up. So now that we have the intercooler installed and all the piping, we're gonna mount the brackets on. RIPP supplies you with L brackets and hardware to install this. We're going to use our 10mm hardware to install in the top of the bracket. Next, we'll be removing the factory temp sensor. You want to spin this counterclockwise, and then we can go ahead and wiggle it out. And we're going to remove the O-ring. Plug it in. And insert it into that grommet. You're gonna need to bend this line up some. Now we're ready to install the air inlet hat on the supercharger. We're going to begin by pulling off the blue cover. And since we clearanced the fan, we should be able to sneak the hat in there. You want to install the supplied clamp, and then we'll fish that through. It's going to be a little bit of a struggle, so don't be scared. Once you have it on, you want to wiggle it, point it up slightly, and then we can go and tighten that clamp up a little bit. You want to make sure that you put the clamp in an accessible spot, as there is not a lot of room in here. Next step, we're going to install the coolant expansion tank and its bracket. We'll need to remove this plug here from our stock air box. And after cutting out the template in the back of the booklet, we're going to drill our 3 holes, and then we'll mount that bracket in. You're going to need a 17/64 drill bit. So now that we have our holes drilled, we're going to go ahead and bolt this bracket in. You're going to have a plate and nuts for the bottom, so we're going to go under and we're going to bolt that together. All right, so we're going to put the plate on. And we'll get all the nuts on and we'll tighten that bracket up. And to access this area, you can just peel the fender liner back and you'll be able to see the bolts. Using a 10mm socket, you can tighten up the 3 bolts. Now that we have the bracket on, we'll take the new expansion tank, slide that down over the bracket, make sure that it clicks firmly. Once it's secure, we can go ahead and hook the line up. So now that we have the overflow tank installed, we're going to go ahead and attach the new line. We removed the one from the factory overflow tank. And now we're going to cut this to size and install that. So next we're going to install the PCV check valve. This is a one-way valve and it keeps boost from entering the crankcase. So we're going to pull off this line here, insert and clamp. We'll attach that onto here. Tighten our clamp up. Now that we have that on there, we're going to trim this a little bit, and then we'll hook it onto there. Once again, install your clamp. Insert that on there, and then we'll tighten our clamp up. Next step, we're going to remove this evap line. We're going to install this T-fitting in here. We'll have to trim this and attach that on here. We're going to route this line down here, and they provide you with zip ties so you can avoid all the drive belts. Now that we have our line connected from the blow-off valve to our evap system, we have that all taken care of. We'll move on to our next step. All right, so now we're ready to install the air filter. We go ahead, place that on. Hook these 2 lines up. And move this line from this side over to here. Give us a little more length. Now, depending how tight the fit is, you may have to trim the fan some more to fit the air filter on. Looks like we have it fitting nicely, so we're going to go ahead and tighten up our clamp. Now that we've completed the installation of the whole entire system, we're going to reinstall the grille and tidy up some loose ends. The lower section of the grille just clicks in. We're going to plug our lights back in. Then we're going to reinstall the push pins in the top. Now we're going to reinstall the upper shroud. Reinsert the push pins. So we're ready to fill up the coolant system. We're going to remove the cap. funnel, and then we're going to use the same coolant that we saved when we emptied the system out. So that's good enough for now. Once we get the vehicle started and purge the air bubbles out, we'll go ahead and top the rest off. As of right now, we're just going to put some in the overflow and we'll fill that up. Congratulations, you've now completed your install of the RIPP Supercharger. You're done. Close your hood. You're all finished.
So if you're looking for an easy to install supercharger kit for your JK, I definitely recommend this option from RIPP, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.